A very warm welcome to this webinar hosted by the Norwegian Business Association in Singapore. We will today cover a big topic. Where is the shipping industry heading? Sponsored and supported by the Norwegian Embassy in Singapore, Innovation Norway, Simonsen Vogtvik, Kongsberg and Flock. Let me please welcome Norway's ambassador to Singapore, Her Excellency Anita Nego, to give the opening remarks.
Pleasure for me to welcome you all to this webinar on the future of the shipping industry. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you all to this webinar on the future of the shipping industry. Allow me to thank NBAS for organizing this very timely event and our moderators and panelists who will share their perspectives with us today. We live in interesting times, as the Chinese would say. 2020 has been a year like no other, and it is not over yet. There is a lot of uncertainty going forward. The maritime industry, or should we say the ocean-based distribution and logistics industry, is at an inflection point. Three driving forces will change the way the industry operates. They are disruption, digitalization, and decarbonization. First on disruption. Even before the pandemic, the US-China trade war created a lot of uncertainty. Then came COVID-19, which has, of course, been a major disruption across the world and across industries. The maritime industry suffered a heavy blow at the start of the pandemic. Activity levels seem to have picked up, albeit unevenly. And let us not forget that crew change remains a major concern, with around 800,000 seafarers unable to sign on or off their ships. This poses a threefold challenge: a humanitarian tragedy, a risk to health, security and the environment, and the potential disruption of supply chains. Perhaps will there also be other lasting effects of these disruptions on consumer preferences, production patterns, regionalization of supply chains, energy production, or recruitment to the industry. Second, on digitalization. Here we see that the pandemic has accelerated underlying trends away from manual processes, forcing an industry that many had accused of lagging behind to embrace new digital tools and working methods. This is a game changer for the industry and companies, allowing improvements in productivity and new synergies with adjacent industries, be it manufacturing or logistics. It will also require a workforce with the right skills. Third, on decarbonization. The looming climate crisis and the need to decarbonize all types of human activities will require profound changes within the industry in order for it to meet the emission targets set by the IMO. It is encouraging to see the commitment from the industry and the efforts now underway by industry actors, governments, and researchers across the globe to develop the new technologies needed in marine fuels, ship design and operations, or port operations. In Norway, we have launched a number of programs and projects on digitalization and decarbonization, designed to ensure that we remain at the forefront of developments. Norway will continue to invest in and support the maritime industry. We will do so in close collaboration with partners across the world, among which Singapore is perhaps the closest one. We are like-minded countries concerned with upholding a rules-based international order, free trade, and open sea lines of communication. The maritime industry itself is key for us to succeed. I therefore look forward to listening to the discussion. I know it will be an interesting one, given our outstanding panelists with tons of hands-on experience from the industry. Thank you.
If you are an NBUS member and based in Singapore, you will have a chance to win one of these awesome chairs we have in the studio today, manufactured in Norway. So keep tuned throughout this webinar, and we will give you a hint and an answer. You have to send the reply to admin@nbus.org.sg. Question is coming your way. First one sending the correct answers get the chair. We have a great panel with us today. Let me please welcome Lawrence Odfjell, Chair of Odfjell SE, Andreas Somen-Powell, Chairman of BW Group, Cristina Sanz de Santa Maria from DNV GL, and Paul Kastman from Innovation Norway. A warm welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Let me first ask Paul to give a brief intro to a foresight study done by Innovation Norway, where you focus on the ocean industries in Singapore and the possible future scenarios, because this will set the scene for the discussion. What is your key findings, Paul?
Well, since the start of this year, we've obviously been in a fairly uncertain situation with regards to the way that the maritime industry is going to develop, but also the economy at large. And so what we felt was there is a need for a study into possible scenarios. And essentially, there are obviously different kinds of drivers behind the kind of recovery that we will see and the development of the industry. There are purely epidemiological factors like how when will there be a vaccine, will there be new waves of infections coming, and what kind of a response will there be from governments and so on. And then there are several trends and drivers that have been in existence and could be seen before the pandemic, but that have been sort of intensified by the pandemic. And for instance, it could be global trading patterns. We've seen some changes to that. Access to talent, obviously, of increased importance, or the adoption of new technology. So we're essentially looking at autonomous ships. It could be decarbonization technologies and so on. And so in a very unpredictable environment, we felt it was interesting to talk to business, both on Singapore side and the Norwegian side, to see what kind of scenarios we could possibly see so that we could be prepared for all of them, essentially. So we had a discussion and we concluded that obviously we can look at all the different kinds of drivers and we tried to incorporate them into the analysis, but there were particularly two that we were looking at. One of them was the global trading patterns and how they are changing. Will they change massively or less so? That will obviously impact the industry. The other aspect was changes to the access of workforce. And remember that we were having a predominantly Singaporean vantage point here, since this is where we are after all. And for instance, you might see an increase in protectionism and regionalization. Arguably, this is something that we saw before the pandemic, but the impact of global supply chains and also wanting to protect jobs obviously also helped intensify that. Then we would look at Singapore as a maritime hub. How will this be affected by it? And also, with the less global trade, what kind of ships will we be needing in the future? Will there be possibly more need for autonomous ships? There are different kinds of changes. So we were exploring those kinds of scenarios. And this is obviously something we did before the summer. So I'd be very interested now to hear, now that the world has changed, also from Lawrence and Andreas as ship owners, and of course also from Cristina as a class society, how they view some of these issues.
Yeah, so if there's one thing, Paul, that you should say is the most important for the Norwegian setting in Singapore based on your study, what would that possibly be?
Well, I'm thinking that with an intensified view on and focus on digital technology in general, that's something that's been going on for some time. It's taken for granted now that you're working on digital solutions for shipping. But autonomy is definitely something that is coming rapidly. And we do see a couple of days ago a collaboration agreement between, or a roadmap rather, between Sintev Ocean and TCOMS on how to work on this in particular. And there are several other kinds of collaboration in this area. So on autonomy, I think it's an interesting area. If you look at as technology providers, for instance, into the yards, that aspect is interesting, as well as decarbonization, that we do see this coming in such a rapid speed. And if, for instance, it is more difficult to have laborers coming from across the region into work at the yards, you might want to choose to recruit more local workers. There will be a difference on the cost aspect of running the yards. Then obviously you will need to upgrade the production. And I think that could actually be something that's suitable for Norwegian companies delivering technology that is very high end, I'd say.
Thank you, Paul. As a preparation for this webinar, we have received questions from industry players in Singapore amongst the Norwegian community here. And there is one thing that is quite high up on the agenda, and we're going to have one webinar coming up, which is focusing on the decarbonization. But I think it's important for us to raise that issue right here as well with the audience we have. So how do you decarbonize an industry built on carbon? And are the industry collectively moving this forward fast enough? And the second question, what do you see as being shipping's fuel in the future? Maybe if I can ask Lawrence first.
Okay. Well, first of all, there's just come out now by IMO has launched now the findings about how to go forward on reducing carbon emissions and setting targets on reducing carbon intensity by 40% by 2030. Some believe maybe that is too little, but this is an important first step, and that one can see maybe future acceleration of this going forward. But I think the decarbonization with existing technologies, that a goal of 40% seems achievable, and that's a positive. And I think it's also therefore very important that IMO sets goals that are achievable, even though they are ambitious. So from the starting point, it's important that IMO and all stakeholders are working together to reach set targets that we can reach. And I'm personally very in favor of this. I don't know, Andreas, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I think I agree that we need to progress, and these regulations are important. I think talking about how do we get there and the change, I classify change in two categories. One is incremental change, and the other is dramatic, disruptive change. And I think most of human invention over time has been more of the incremental type. Every so often you see a dramatic cliff type change. But we tend to grasp at the cliff type because it's sexier and more exciting. So hydrogen, we're going to have it tomorrow and it's going to be great and it's going to solve everything. Whereas I think the more likely is that we have to sweat all the small stuff, which means efficiency improvements, getting technology to work better, doing transition fuels, which have arguments for and against. But unless you want to just sit and wait for 10, 20 years for hydrogen to be available at the right cost, we need to take these incremental steps. And what's encouraging is to see so much of the industry working on all these different elements, not just sitting waiting for the big one.
Yeah, I'll get to Lawrence, but just one question first, maybe.
Sure.
So if you look into the future, maybe 10, 15 years down the road, Andreas, what do you think is going to drive your ships?
So I think it's going to be a multiple of different solutions. We're invested in batteries for short sea. We've invested in a battery company. We're doing LPG conversion for LPG ships because that works very well, availability of cargo. We have LNG on our LNG ships and we're putting it on some tankers. We're investing in methanol. We're looking at all these solutions. Ammonia and hydrogen, again, they're sort of holy grail that are out there, but it's not ready yet. So we will work on this. We've carried ammonia in the past on our LPG ships and we'll work on it. But so if you're asking me the next 10 years, I think it's all these different things that I mentioned. If you're asking further out, then maybe ammonia. I think hydrogen's even further out. Just one other comment on this. You asked, I think, in your question, you're saying, what are we going to be carrying? And I think that that's a relevant question as well, because, if we're not using oil, if the world transitions to an electrified world, then we also have to be thinking about what type of ships we need from a cargo point of view.
Lawrence?
Absolutely. I also think that the goals that now been set to reach the 40% reduction is the incremental existing technology improvements, including also improving digitalization. The important thing to think about is that it's not the ships that have to provide, the biggest investments are not going to be in ships to have the solution for hydrogen or ammonia. It's all the shore infrastructure. Who's going to produce carbon-free ammonia? Who's going to produce carbon-free hydrogen? And so we're preparing to have ships built that can go on ammonia and go on hydrogen maybe, but it's going to be a long road to get to where we can get it in the major ports around the world.
And fuel cells, you're investing in fuel cells now, right?
We are experimenting with that. We have a proof of concept. We're working together with a group of industry players, and we are testing this. And those fuel cells can burn basically methanol, LNG, ammonia, or hydrogen, and they're produce the hydrogen at the cell. And the proof of concept is coming out on an auxiliary engine, but we believe it's scalable. But that's, again, I think, further out.
If I might just say, I think that is going to be extremely important flexibility, you know, in these years. So you have your full systems that are able to adapt as the technology advances. Right? And I think that what is really important is that we don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Exactly.
Right? Because there are solutions available today that can be, you know, already implemented in the new buildings.
Sure. So we live in a changing world, and it's rapidly becoming more uncertain on many levels. But how do you see that as an owner? You know, where are you investing now for the future? What is the most important for you moving forward? Maybe I can go to Andreas first.
So I think again, I would sort of caution against dramatic overnight changes where one says, you know, it's the end of this or the end of that, and we have to shift everything, you know, overnight, because change tends to come incrementally. I think actually for existing assets, let's take the oil and gas sector as an example, energy shipping or chemicals. There is a very plausible scenario where we manage in a flat or even shrinking world by having some discipline and on the supply side. So capital discipline, investing discipline. You see it in oil production now because people are cutting back on capex. And actually what you'll see is even as demand flattens or comes off a bit, that supply is flattening. We have this great thing in shipping. In oil production, it's called depletion. And in shipping, it's called depreciation or rust. And the very rusting of ships is a supply moderating measure. The only thing we have to avoid is this self-defeating move that we've always done in the past, which is to rush out and order new ships. As soon as it looks like it's going to be a little bit better, we go and order a lot more. And I hope now with technology change, but also with this question, what are we going to be carrying in the ships, that we just think twice before pulling the trigger on changing. The other part of, you know, your question is, of course, we need to invest in new sustainable areas. We've invested in batteries. We've just recently made an investment in biofuels. We have a team working on solar. We're looking at wind. So we are sort of looking at what's coming around the horizon. But it's very difficult to make big swings because these are areas by definition that you don't know as well, and also areas where there's a lot of capital crowding in. So we're trying to walk a little bit two roads at the same time.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. I think that's absolutely true. The general development is obviously incremental technological change. And I also agree with your point that you shouldn't rush immediately once there is a need to buy. And at the same time, also, when it comes to technological change, if you look, for instance, at the phasing in of renewable energy, essentially, you've seen over the past decade that the prognosis have been incremental, but in fact, the phasing in has been exponential. Because when it comes to technological change, they haven't factored in that it's going to be a lot more cheaper. Technology is becoming so cheap that it is, in fact, available much earlier than you would think from a cost perspective. The reason why I mention it is because we shouldn't forget to factor that in when we plan.
Yeah, because that can bring us also off on the wrong foot.
Yeah, the only slight sort of counterpoint to that is I think it's absolutely true, and we can all see it. The levelized cost of electricity is coming down so fast for wind and solar, and the plans and projects to build out gigawatts, terawatts of new electricity is coming, and that can become very fast and disruptively. I think the part that we often forget about is you need to look at total system cost. And because of intermittency, you need either storage or you need gas power stations which can ramp up and down to fill all these gaps. And suddenly the cost is not the same. In fact, you're building a lot of redundancy and extra power plants to deal with cycling and intermittency.
That is true.
So levelized cost only on the front end is not the full picture.
That is very true.
Yeah.
So
in terms of the cargo, just to go back to that too, I think that I read the energy transition report every year updated from DNV GL, and I think that's a great way of a glance into the future. And you see the mix, how things are changing. You see how the circular economy, how that may affect as well on different type of raw materials, feedstocks. So there's all this should form the picture. When we invest in ships, we have to think a lifespan of 20 to 30 years. And so 30 years from now, we're at 2050. Our carbon intensity is supposed to be down by 70%. It's not even possible with technology today, which also adds to I think we're going to see discipline from investors in terms of speculatively building all types of ships when we don't yet know what's the true winning path or the scalable path for a more less carbon intensive future.
Right. I wanted to ask Christina, actually, do you feel that the DNV GL energy transition report is sort of built on conservative or aggressive philosophy when it says that things are leveling off and coming down, oil, for instance? Is that how much conviction is there?
No, I think we have been told that we were a bit aggressive before, but now with the COVID, of course, that has also had an impact, right? And you see the reduction of energy demand by 0.8%. Now we have actually heard more external parties saying that they agree on it. So yeah. So, but of course, time will see. And I mean, we don't know the future, and that's why we do annual revisions, because things change so much. But hopefully this triggers good discussions.
Yes.
And so it's not written on stone.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I hear, maybe you have a view on this, Christina, but is the electric cars. So people say, the world's going to change because electric cars are coming so fast. So one of the statistics I heard is we have 1 billion cars in the world right now. We have about 7 million electric cars, something like that. Maybe it's 10, but on 1 billion. And in 2045, in fact, this was a recent report came out, 2045, it said we're going to have 450 million electric cars, right? And I've seen BP with 400 and others with these numbers, 500 million electric cars, but we're going to have 2 billion cars by then in total. And so I don't know whether this is, all projections and guesses about the future, but if we have rising population, rising affluence, rising number of cars, are we chasing our own tail and actually finding that the denominator is growing, even if the numerator of electric cars is growing?
Yeah,
exactly.
No, I agree. I don't have the answer to that, but it's definitely something to look at. But again, I think it's really a complex outlook, right? So you cannot see one dimension alone. I think everything is a bit interconnected, right? So of course you have electrification, which will be a key trend, but you will have huge efficiency. And I think efficiency is going to be key, not only, in shipping, because you were talking about the new fuels are going to be more expensive in totality. So you need to look at your efficiency to consume less fuel and, make sure that all the systems are there. So I think you cannot look at just one thing. It's several dimensions.
The Danish Future Institute is saying that with car sharing, there's going to be tremendous shrinkage of the car fleet. So nobody there's another trend, with automation, with you don't, like in Denmark now, you have a car service, basically. You don't own your own car. You subscribe to a service. So these things can radically, when you think about how little each car is used.
Yes. Well, I think that's a great point, and it's a real worry, I would imagine, for car manufacturers. I think for energy suppliers, my hope is, as long as the journeys still take place, so you utilize the assets a lot more,
But as long as you still do as many journeys, you'll still
Yes.
consume,
Yes.
and I'm talking from a sort of energy provider point of view,
Yes.
not from planetary point of view. But you know, the journeys may still be high.
Yeah. Let me stay a little bit with DNV GL. Right, we've seen tremendous changes globally with trade patterns and power play, etc. How will global against regional regulations impact the industry, and what is the role of the classification society in this setting?
Well, I think shipping is a global industry, so I think it would benefit from having, global regulations. However, I think if we are looking at the press, and the history of the last years, we are seeing regions and countries, taking their own stand because, from the global side, it goes too slow. So I think it's gonna make the picture and the job of the ship owners more complex, unfortunately, if we continue to see those, regionalization. It is nothing that we as a class society can decide. I guess that we all, as a stakeholder in this industry, we all have a voice and we can, try to push and lobby. However, it's not in our power to decide that. So from our side is to support the industry to make sure that the technology, whatever it's needed, is safe, and that hopefully it's globally available, and that we encourage to have a level playing field.
Yeah,
that's.
If I could just mention on this one, and I've heard it quite often now, so it's probably getting a bit cliched, but there's this African proverb: if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think one of the things we have to keep reminding ourselves is, are we in a sprint or are we in a marathon? Do we want to solve this in the long run, or do we want to chalk up quick wins in the near term? In an ideal world, we do both, right? But if we had to choose, the great power and the beauty of IMO, and we're the only industry, I think, in the world that can do this with global regulation. The beauty is that we move the whole industry together and we go far because we go together. And the danger of this go fast, come up with individual regulations is you don't get as far. You move fast, but you don't get as far. The flip side is it takes time. If you want to convince 200 countries to go with you, you have to do a lot of lobbying, a lot of talking. It takes time and people get frustrated. But I hope this regulatory cycle is quicker than like ballast water management. But let's give IMO some time to do its work, to rally countries behind, and we will find we go further.
So let's go back a few months to maybe January and February this year, and it was an extreme period for all businesses. What really went through your mind in January and February when you're thinking about your industries, how you're going to push through this, and how did it, come to this stage right now?
Well, we had, from our side, we had been working on contingency plans for a while. Shipping has been in a continuous crisis for the last 10 years. So we're used to planning for the worst case scenarios. So we had scenarios in place, and we had already in place certain actions we were going to take, and we acted upon them, and we developed further actions. We were afraid that access to finance would dry up. So we accelerated any refinancings that we need to do just to make sure that we weren't caught at a time when windows were closed. But what this has developed into, from our perspective, has been the cost, the human cost of our seafarers. The fact that we can't get our seafarers, I think this later on today as well, we can talk more about that. But the fact that seafarers, essential workers that are supplying the food and the medical equipment needed around the world today, they can't go home, is a major issue. And that has been taking more and more of our time, and we are not seeing, it's been a frustrating slow progress also by IMO to get this high enough on the agenda.
Andreas, do you have something you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, there is, I would echo, what Lawrence was just saying. I think there's a passive response, which is absolutely the industry is used to volatility and we just take it. We're used to it after such a long time. There's the kind of short-term response, which is one needs to do all the things in the business. Refinancing is one example, but outperformance on sort of day-to-day metrics and how you run the business. And then there's the long term. On this outperformance, I mean, you know, it's not to sort of blow our own trumpet, but to take an example, one of our companies, BW LPG, it had a 30% annualized return on equity in the first half of this year, and our biggest competitor was 6%. And over the last 4 quarters, we achieved a 36% ROE, and our largest competitor was 12%. And sort of being able to really maximize utilization and what we get out of the assets is, I think, you know, the best response you can have in good times and in bad times. Longer term, well, I can say more, but maybe I'll just stop there and we can talk about longer term.
Just to
later.
focus on keeping the wheels turning. Just focus on operations. Focus on operations.
That's right.
That's really been.
Yeah. And crewing is obviously a big part of that, and probably the biggest worry is to get people home. You know, it's,
Okay, so we are in Singapore and we got quite a few questions narrowing down on Singapore's maritime and shipping scene. How do you consider the yards in Singapore to be positioned for the future? Is the industry here ready for digitalization and the emergence of autonomous ships? Are autonomous ships seriously a viable option for the shipping industry? You have put a lot of investments into your current fleet. How do you see this? Is it a viable option?
I have a view, but maybe we should ask, let others speak.
If it is a viable option, I think, I mean, you can divide it into time periods here, I think. If you look at the next 10 years, I mean, you might be looking at autonomy being used in tugboats and more near shipping, port operations, and these kinds of things. You won't see it in deep sea shipping or tankers or bulkers or those kinds of ships. But it could be in the long run. But again, we're talking about regulations here. We're talking about global regulations, and ship transport is a global trade, whereas the kind of regulations you need to have an autonomous vessel driving around on the seas is going to cross a lot of land borders, and that's going to be some complexity involved. And then we don't really know how will it interact with people operated ships and so on. So there are many unknowns here that needs to be researched and tested and so on. But I'm certain that we will have a further push due to exactly what you're talking about with the crew changes. There have been some challenges with that, future security for them. So there could be a push for autonomy in some instances, I believe, going forward.
But is this a part of the strategic thinking in BW Group, Andreas, long term?
So I think that there are steps towards it. And step one is you need to have all the technology and systems, the sensors, the data gathering, the dashboards, all that I mean, going to autonomous without a means of controlling the vessel is just fanciful. So step one, get sensors, systems, dashboards, information, data running. Step two is you can maybe start to reduce crew a little bit. Step three, you need a regulatory backdrop to allow, you know, ships to interact and ports and how all the mechanisms. And then maybe step four, you get to autonomy. But it's a little bit like what I said earlier. Autonomy is a nice buzzword and we get very excited about it, but it's years and years out. And I just see an incredible lack of people taking the first step. I mean, I say it with a bit of self-interest because we've invested in a technology platform called Alpha Ori. We've invested in another one called Miros, which is measuring real-time currents and weather and so on. But that has to be the starting point in this journey.
Yeah, Lawrence.
Well, I'm going to be polemical then. First of all, I think Internet of Things is valuable, and the fact that the sensors we're getting on our ships, the kind of information that we can, the efficiency we're getting out of our ships today by having alarms go off in rooms ashore saying, hey, there's something strange going. Why is this accelerator engine running when you don't have the cargo program? All that kind of algorithms are happening. We're getting better efficiency. All good. But if we want to save the planet, if we want to reduce global warming, it's not autonomous ships that's going to solve this. It's the fuel efficiency. And if autonomous shipping somehow means that we can burn less fuel, I don't think so. Then all for it. I don't think so. We see from our experience the hostile environment of the sea, the constant battle to maintain the ship, the deck in order. I don't see it. I don't see it deep sea. I can see it for short sea. I can see it in port applications, but I don't see it deep sea for a long time in the future. And I think we should spend our energy on saving the planet, because I think we have a real urgency of getting our emissions down and attack this on many levels, whether it be efficiency, carbon capture, cyclical economy. There's so many important things that government can help make happen via policy that to me much more important than autonomous shipping.
But it will drive, I mean, if you reduce the crew, right, those small steps in between, you would also get some efficiency. And I think that the efficiency and the cost saving is going to be the biggest driver of this happening.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, if I could, with regards to collaboration, international collaboration, because there are a lot of initiatives going on around the world when it comes to decarbonization. I totally agree with you. That should be the priority number one, because it's an existential issue.
Yeah.
And but there is a lot of activities, initiatives going on around the world to have a platform where we could gather experiences and share them, like the NextGen IMO Singapore initiative. I think is a good initiative, a promising one, where you could share experiences between each other and get to know what is going on around the world. I think it's important. And also, for instance, if you have industries or stakeholders in the Norwegian side in this case, and in the Singapore side, to have joint industry projects and focus the attention on joint challenges, I think is a good way to work together on solving these issues.
Lawrence?
I think there are a lot of very interesting opportunities in terms of safety related to autonomous shipping, collision control systems, mooring systems. There's a lot of things that are very valuable and important from a safety perspective. So all these technologies going towards something I'm all for, but the idea of autonomous shipping as such, as an end game, I'm more skeptical for the reason.
But I think maybe, and it's an echo, maybe a slight disagreement with the point about fuel savings. I think if we can gather the right data, there will be lots of spin-off benefits. Safety absolutely is one, sort of cost savings in terms of manpower is another, but actually vessel routing, optimal routing, predictive maintenance, stopping breakdowns, or preventing breakdowns from happening by knowing early. There are so many spin-off benefits. It's just that we're incredibly behind on gathering data about our assets. I mean, the airlines, the aircraft are way ahead on measuring this. Nuclear power plants are way ahead of this, and here we are in shipping flying blind.
But actually, relatively. We're far from aviation, but actually, we've been looking a lot at machine learning in the last few years, and we are far along on the Internet of Things. We're putting lots and lots of sensors on our ships, and we are getting tremendous efficiencies out of it, and also improved safety. And the machine learning part is just going to add to this.
Exactly.
So we're already doing this. We're getting help. This is not something we had originally in-house. We need help, but this path is happening. There are people out there that know how to do this, and we're taking that learning also from aviation industry. There's no reason whatsoever. It's today within both technological and economical. It's not something that's a high threshold anymore in terms of cost. So it's at least from our perspective. I have mentioned before we started today, I mentioned to you that since 2014, we have reduced our fuel efficiency by 30%. And our goal now, our board just made a commitment that we will reduce our carbon intensity by 50% by 2030. And we have done a gap analysis per ship, per trade, to understand how we're going to get there, and we can do so by just using available technology, using sensors as well, etc. So the digital interface is helping us real time.
Okay. So if you may, we have a big election coming up in the US, and it's maybe a question you don't want to answer, but I'll make an attempt anyway. What do you hope for as a result from the election in the US because of the scale of the industry and the market in the US? Oil output, demand for energy transition, etc. Will, the outcome of all this will depend on who wins. What do you hope for, Andreas?
So, I won't say what I hope for, because I'm not a US citizen. It's not my place to
express preferences and so on. I have a major concern about what's been happening, which is the destruction of domestic and multilateral institutions. And I think we've started to take for granted that the peace and prosperity we have is because of all these amazing institutions that were built after the war. And we have the biggest country in the world now, which started by withdrawing from the TPP negotiations, tore up the JPCOA with Iran, withdrew from the Paris Agreement, froze the WTO through the appellate system, withdrew from WHO during a pandemic. I mean, these are systematic attacks on multilateral institutions that has to stop, because otherwise we're going to have a very chaotic world. Domestically, just as an aside, if you read Michael Lewis, The Fifth Risk, he talks about how, the handover, the transition process back in 2016, they were doing the handover for the nuclear arsenal and nobody showed up at the DOE. And so if you don't trust institutions, global or national, you have a big problem. On shale specifically, I mean, clearly the signal has been made. A Biden administration, if he gets in, would sort of favor renewables, slow down shale production. It probably isn't dramatic because the government can only ban fracking on federal land, not on private land. And it's a good revenue earner for the US. And, I don't think it'll be, again, a cliff, but it will swing the balance in favor of renewables versus shale.
Lawrence, you're nodding. Are you?
I'm nodding, so I'm clearing my whole body language. Disagree.
Okay.
Couldn't catch that on camera, but no, I'm all for multilateralism, and I can only and trade global trade is also a peacekeeper. So not only has it brought prosperity, interdependence of nations with each other is a major deterrent against hostilities. So this unilateral attack on multilateral institution is, I find, a risky game to play. So I'm also for a solution where hopefully the United States comes back to the table and joins the world community.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking about the same thing. Essentially, I mean, obviously, if you have a re-election of Trump, we can expect them to continue down the same path, being very tough on China, as they say, and so on. But also have to remember that there is one of very few issues that there is bipartisan agreement on in the US is, in fact, to be tough on China. So Biden is also probably going to be that. But on the other hand, he's also probably going to go back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That is something that I think he might be going back to. So there could be positive developments in other areas with a Biden presidency, as opposed to say, Trump, because he is more of the, shall we say, establishment or the old school. He believes in multilateral institutions much more than Trump does.
Okay.
And maybe if I can just add to that, I think, you mentioned earlier the idea of trade regionalization as a possible trend. And I hear this quite a lot. I think there are good arguments, and you mentioned earlier some of them, which is reshoring, security of supply chains and digitalization allowing reshoring, tariffs, going up, that drives regionalization. Also, there's sort of a limit to how much can you stuff in a box eventually. I mean, in 1960, we traded less than 10% of world GDP, and by 1990, it was 30%, and in 2008, it was 50%. So, there's a limit to how much you can trade all this stuff. But the counter argument, and why I wouldn't write off global trade, is because actually, as long as you have a world where you get disagreements between countries, whether it's a peaceful world or not, it drives ton miles. And when the US doesn't want to buy crude from Venezuela, it sails to China. And when Europe is worried about Russian gas, you get LNG coming in. And when China is fighting with Australia, you get iron ore coming from Brazil instead. And so you're driving ton miles through, through disturbances. And the other reason I wouldn't write it off is because we read all this political rhetoric in the press. but underpinning it is business pragmatism and business reality. We see gas, we see oil flowing to the US, we see soybeans from US to China, I mean. And so even while there's all this noise at the top, you know, there are flows. Having said that, I think a reduction in temperature and less tariffs would help with that. But I don't think we should write off global trade quite yet.
Sure. And then we have the other superpower, which is obviously China. Do you think that Singapore's maritime and shipping scene will benefit from China's rapid rise because of the position Singapore has as a maritime hub? Christina, you are nodding.
Yeah, no, I think, well, I mean, you cannot, I mean, Singapore has, because of its characteristics, size, right? I mean, it has its role, which can never be compared, right, to other big countries, but I think they have ties, and I think it's a very important and relevant hub in Asia. So as long as Singapore continues to be, you know, ahead of the curve, continue to be an enabler, right? Many times you say, how is life in Singapore? It's easier. It's easy. It works. That's what you need, which sometimes it might be like a hygiene factor thing, but it doesn't happen in other parts of the world. So I think we just need to keep it, you know, being on the edge, and I you know, they will benefit, I think.
Yeah, I think there are several aspects to that relationship. Obviously, Singapore being the biggest investor into China is one aspect. So their rise in that respect obviously pays dividends to Singaporean investors, government being one of them. But also, I think there is a competitive aspect because of the yards. Obviously, we're talking about the maritime industry, and there is a competition with the Chinese yards. Like all yards around the world are feeling that, and the rise and the you know, technological know-how and so on in China. So there is a competition aspect. But all in all, I think that Singapore will attain a sort of a maritime hub position, even though China is rising up, because it is in effect covering Southeast Asia. So I think it's not going to be threatened that much. There is also the aspect of Belt and Road initiatives. I mean, you have all these contracts between China and other countries around the world being all denominated in Chinese, essentially. That's the only version there is. There's a Chinese version, and everyone needs to read Chinese in order to interpret what is in the contract. And Singapore is positioning themselves as being a sort of a court of arbitration for those kinds of contracts because of the language know-how and so on. And it's a sort of a neutral country. So in many respects, I think it's a relationship that works well for Singapore.
Sure. Andres.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk about Singapore as a maritime hub in a moment, but just one macro comment, since you mentioned China. A prosperous China is a prosperous world and is a prosperous Singapore. And, you know, I think we need to reframe the thinking a little bit, because there's all this sort of China bashing going on in Europe and the US and so on. If you look back to 1500, the last 400 years, there have been three great empires or superpowers: the Netherlands, Britain, and America. And if you look back 1,400 years to 600 AD, the first 1,000 years, there was one superpower, and that was China. And there was a brief interlude in 1300 when the Mongols came in, but they were absorbed by the Chinese. So, you know, this is the last 400 years is a historical aberration if you take the long view.
It's true.
And if you look at China's rise now by any metric, it's coming back, and it will be the largest economy and superpower. There's nothing to stop it. So the only question you have to ask is, are you going to fight it and make an enemy and turn the world chaotic and make everything ugly? Or are you going to work alongside? It's not to just give up on everything and you know, let China do whatever it wants, but work in parallel and in collaboration, and don't see it as this great peril. It's actually good for world prosperity. But also don't think we can impose a sort of modern Western political system on an ancient civilization. I mean, that's very arrogant.
Yes, sure. I want to focus a little bit on Singapore. And how can Singapore protect and further strengthen its position as a maritime hub? We have talked a little bit about it, and we see good initiatives in Singapore within the Pier 71. Digitalization is going on, startups are coming into the shipping scene. But what should Singapore do? If there's one thing Singapore should do, it's not currently doing. What is it? Difficult one. Andreas, you work quite a bit with.
The one thing for Maritime Hub to help propel it forward. I'll avoid kind of talking about silver bullet because it's usually more complex than that, obviously. You know, the maritime strategy, if you read the IMC 2030 report or the industry transformation map, the three keywords were connectivity, innovation, and talent. And there were two other concepts. One is building up the cluster, and the other one is being a standard bearer for ideas and thoughts and so on. So, you know, I think it can be a simple case of scoring, you know, ourselves against these different metrics. You know, connectivity and building up the cluster, I think it's strong, but we're fighting headwinds because, you know, when business is under pressure, they tend to sort of gravitate back to their home countries and so on. So there needs to be active work to strengthen the cluster. Innovation, there are all these initiatives around digitalization, very complex. It's a topic in its own right. You need the financing systems, you need risk taking, but at least all the seeds are being sown. And I'm actually quite confident that innovation is accelerating and happening, partnerships around the world and so on. And then the talent piece is, you know, there's so much work going into it. And I like to think if we can continue to talk well of the maritime industry, don't be too shy and sort of beating ourselves up and sharing all the fun stuff we're doing and good things, that people will come and we'll get talent, we'll develop talent, we'll attract talent. And then this last piece was around standard bearer topic. So, you know, one needs to know what's important, what are the big themes of the day. And I think this is where the government here is so thoughtful, takes input, understands decarbonization as a big theme, and that creates a magnet for smart people, for ideas, for innovation. And digitalization is another one. You know, it creates a magnet for people to work on things. And I think as long as the community keeps talking and says, this is the big topic we need to work on, we will see this snowball, you know, of good activity happening. So no silver bullet, sorry.
No, that's fine. Lawrence, you work in the industry globally, right? So you see what's happening in the US compared to Asia. And what do you think Singapore should do to further strengthen?
Well, in the theme of decarbonization, then Singapore as a major port and a bunker port, the more one can test concepts in Singapore and compare that to other major ports around the world, if that could be a major role to help move the dial. So for me, that's in line with what we a little bit have been talking about today. So that's what I love about Singapore is also you see the same in Korea, how very good we are here in Singapore at process mapping, very good at understanding getting efficiencies out of systems by process thinking. And that's a real strength. And I see other places around the world where we're not as good at that. I'm not going to name any countries right now, except the Swedish maybe, but just joking. but process mapping. So this is a place where efficiencies can happen because people think through, and it's almost like lean methodology can work themselves out to get more out of the resources. But for me, the big question is, how can Singapore become the port that helps lead the way into a more less carbon intensive future?
Sure. Paul?
Yeah, I think my experience also from being here is that government is very coordinated and across various kinds of ministries is much more coordinated, I would say, possibly back home in Norway. And so to have a holistic approach to putting out plans into action and also to planning in itself, very, very good and efficient, and also very close to business when they actually do implement new policies and so on, very supportive towards industry. What we've seen in Norway that has been very efficient when it comes to generating business ideas and innovation and so on in industries is a cluster program that we've been using. So essentially having companies coming together, defining innovation strategies and goals together. And there are even competitors in the same clusters working together towards a greater good.
And I think that could be one aspect. We're talking about establishing clusters and so on, but doing it in a systematic fashion, and also global clusters, not only Norwegian clusters that have a geographic, according to Porter, right, geographic location and so on, but global clusters, because the problems are, it's going to sound like a cliche, but the problems are global.
Yes.
We have a bit of a big question here at the end, but I have to ask it. So, and we talked a bit about it already. But how will the global trading patterns develop going forward? Will we see less globalization and more protectionism and regional trade? How will this affect Singapore's role as a maritime hub? And also, will it affect the kind of ships being built? Bit of complexity in that one, but
yeah. Well, I think I tried to answer that in part earlier, saying that you know, even though there are reasons for regionalization, actually global trade continues, you know, apace. And just to give one example, maybe to supplement what I was saying, look at the container trade now. You know, part of that is because of air cargo going into ships, but actually the container trade is booming. You know, in the middle of a global economic slowdown. And it's all, you know, long haul, cross global trade, US, China, in spite of all the rhetoric. And so I think that the real facts are that global trade in ships is alive and well. And, you know, I don't see dramatic changes in other than the propulsion side in terms of, for instance, ship size. I mean, we've sort of raced up in tankers and dry bulk and containers, and we probably reach a sort of plateau in terms of size. Yeah.
You're seeing a little bit of reconditioning because of the offshore segment area. In a way, some ships are being in a way refit for other purposes. That's happening right now. But in terms of deep sea, every time we read the headlines, and for instance, the war on plastics, which is of course a serious issue for the planet. But when we broke down, for instance, for our trade, what that meant, how much of our trade was actually liquids that was feedstock into the call it the plastic industry, it turned out it was 2 or 3%. It was so every time you read things, headline news. I'm not saying we should be much better at circular economy around plastics, etc. And it's coming. It's a lot of exciting new developments there. But right now, the whole issue of protectionism has been increasing a lot. All kinds of countries since 2012. There's some kind of university in Zug or somewhere in Switzerland. They track protective measures happening around the world, and it's been on an increase. So absolutely, there's a threat. But what it comes down to, if we look at what has happened in terms of world trade, yes, we've had a hit now in 2020 because of the pandemic. But if it weren't for the pandemic, the situation would have been quite different. And in the DNV model shows that with the trade is coming back up again in 5 years or something like that. So I don't see this as an existential threat.
Can I just throw out one left field, you know, disruptive change ship type question, which I don't think is likely, but a lot of people are starting to talk about it. We've had 3 companies we've looked at recently. If we get to distributed nuclear, which I know is not popular, has massive kind of pushback, regulatory questions, safe nuclear. So cold fusion or, you know, safe fission. I mean, the change in the industry is going to be massive and maybe catastrophic, by the way, because you will have ships going 50% faster because the fuel is essentially free once you've made the upfront CapEx investment. And the tanks will be empty because you will have cheap energy, not free, high CapEx, but cheap electricity all over the world without intermittency. So you will have solved renewables, you will have solved kind of the power issue, it will be totally clean, and you will need, you know, way less ships because they'll be all going super fast and they'll all be carrying nothing because there won't be any energy. 40% of the world's fleet carries energy.
exactly.
So, you know, but it's probably a long way off, but that's that.
But this type of like a clean power, the thorium concept, which is brilliant, is brilliant. There's an intermediate phase, and that is you can produce carbon free. You can produce hydrogen and ammonia without burning fuel, fossil fuels. So it could actually be the pathway to a much quicker pathway to much less carbon intensity in shipping. And then we're back to, yes, our type of ships will still be. So that's the solution we're going to push for.
Okay,
But I think, you know, it's there.
Yeah.
It's a possibility. So I wouldn't
rule it out.
No, absolutely. You need
coming.
to look at it.
It's coming. It's coming.
So
Is that a part of your long-term planning in DNV GL? It's coming up.
no, but we need to look. I mean, that's our job. Again, I mean, we are independent third party, but we need to look at every possible thing. And we need to keep, you know, and we looked at it some years ago, and now we are, you know, just looking to see how are things there. So,
Paul, you're nodding.
Yeah, I've also talked to companies that are working on this, and there are Norwegian ones talking to Singaporean ones. So there is movement in this area, but yes, it's a long shot, but it's an interesting one.
Well, there's a long shot to move a nuclear powered ship around the world because of all the legislations around the world.
Exactly. Yeah.
But if you're putting it to power the Norwegian oil platforms, you could power. So you're not moving them around, or you're producing green fuels. I mean, that's would solve the kind of
more like.
But I think that's a scenario that needs to be looked at. Absolutely, how it comes in.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we have come to an end, and I thank you all for a very good discussion. We've been sitting on some very comfortable chairs. Anyone of you have these kind of chairs in the office? Flock chairs from Norway?
No, sorry.
Shipping is in crisis. So.
Can we take wait a few years and you go on? All right. Anyway, we have one of these chairs for a lucky winner, NBAS member. And the question you have to answer, you have to send to admin@nbas.org.sg. The first one that sends the correct answer gets the chair. So the question is, in which year was NBAS registered as an association? Good luck to you all. We have a webinar coming up on decarbonization, so please follow that one as well. Thank you all on behalf of NBAS.
Thank you.